And another one done. So this month we read Religion and the Rise of Western Culture, the classic study of medieval civilization by Christopher Dawson. And this 200 something-ish page book, don't be fooled by its size. It's dense and it's full of information. As always, if you haven't joined, please join me in doing the Catholic Reads 2023 challenge. I know we're halfway through the year, 6 months left. That's okay. That's all good. We can start again. 6 months, 6 books. This month we're reading a novel by Evelyn Waugh called Brideshead Revisited, and I would love for you to join. I put a link in the description below. There's information about all the other books that we're going to read. Also, there's a Telegram group that you can join so that I can help motivate you, you can help motivate me, and we meet up once a month at the end of the month to discuss the book together. So I hope to see you there. I really wanted to read this book to enrich my history, my knowledge of history, because as I've mentioned many times, my knowledge of history is very, very bad, and I can't continue to blame that on my horrible education in the Canadian public school system. So I was very excited to read this book. Like I said, it's a very dense book, full of information, and I cannot imagine the amount of work that Christopher Dawson had to do in order to make it this short. So he divides it up into 12 chapters, and each chapter is about 20 pages long. So if you're thinking of reading it, it's really good to actually read one chapter at a time and just digest all that information. So you could actually read this in the span of 12 days if you read 20 pages a day, or you can split it up and divide it more. But I find that going through one chapter at a time and then digesting the information, looking up things I don't know, was very helpful. Though it might be short, it is very thorough. This book is not for someone who is a complete novice, or someone who doesn't know anything about medieval culture, medieval history. You do have to know certain things. I did struggle in the very beginning because I didn't have a great knowledge, or almost no knowledge of the very, very beginnings of medieval history. So I struggled because there were so many groups of people and individuals themselves. Thank you, Train, for stopping by. Something that would have been helpful, that had helped me, was like a map of the different territories that changed over time, because it changed so fast. And for me, I'm very visual, and that kind of helps helps me retain memory of different information. Luckily, my husband helped me because he's really good with history, and so he brought me an atlas that showed different territories at different times of medieval times. So yeah, if you have absolutely no knowledge of medieval civilization, medieval times, this might be a little too difficult. But I think you could get away with reading a chapter, then taking the time, as I did, especially when it came to the initial Dark Ages, to look up different people, different groups of people, and all that jazz. And like I said, it's only 12 chapters, so it is doable if you want to just plunge into the water, so to speak. So now I'm just going to talk about 3 things that I learned that I really, really loved. One of my favorite passages in this book is in the chapter of the conversion of the North, because he talks about how the vernacular was actually used by the church. King Alfred's translation, in the preface to his translation of St. Gregory's treatise on pastoral care, he says, "When I remember all this, then I remember also how I saw before it was all ravaged and burned, how the churches stood all around England, filled with treasures and books, and a great company of God's servants, and how little they felt the profit of books, for they could not understand them because they were not written in our tongue. as if they said our elders who held these places before us loved wisdom, and through it they got wealth and left it to us. Here we may see their traces, but we cannot follow after them. And for that have lost both the wealth and the wisdom, because we were not willing to bend our minds to the pursuit of learning. For it seems well to me that we also change into the tongue, that we will all know the books that are most needful to be known by all men, and we will bring it about, as we very well may, if we have peace, that all the youth of the free men of England, those that have the opportunity to give themselves to it, should be bound to learning, while they can be bound to no other usefulness until the time when they all know how to read English writing. Let them further learn the Latin tongue who desire to learn it and to rise to a higher state. And it was through this that he began his library of translations. So there's this popular misconception that the church was against, using the vernacular, the language of the people that lived in different regions. When that is not completely true. There were many translations before the printing press, before Martin Luther and all that jazz. And that's just one example. One thing I thought was so interesting was that at the end of that chapter, he talks about how Iceland, and it was above all in Iceland that the scholars of the 12th and 13th centuries took up the tradition of King Alfred and founded the great school of vernacular historiography and archaeology, to which we owe so much of our knowledge of the past. It is to the priests and the schools of Christian Iceland that we are indebted for the preservation of the rich tradition of northern mythology and poetry and saga. What I really love about this is that this book too is that perhaps it's because I didn't learn a lot in school, and we were focused mainly on England and France and Italy, from what I remember, the little that we learned. It does cover all of Europe and even Iceland. Like, I never thought of Iceland being part of the medieval time of Western Europe, Western civilization. So that's one thing I learned that was really, really interesting to me. My absolute favorite part of this book was the part where he talked about the cult of love, the new idea of the cult of love. For the age of the Crusades also saw the development of a new secular idea of chivalry, which seems a direct antithesis of St. Bernard's ideal of Christian knighthood and the disciplined austerity of the military orders, while at the same time it was equally remote from the barbaric heroism of northern feudalism. This new ideal is the creation of the South. It arose from the contact between the feudal society of Languedoc and the higher civilization of the Western Mediterranean, which was still the center of Western Islamic culture. The distinctive feature of this new movement were the cult of courtesy and the cult of love. It was concerned above all with the refinement of life, with creating a new pattern of social behavior which centered the ideal of romantic love, and it was reinforced by an elaborate code of manners, which appears sophisticated and subtle even by modern standards, and must have stood out in abrupt and startling contrast to the brutality and violence that still characterized feudal society. It appears abruptly in southern West France about the time of the First Crusade, without any preparation or previous development. Yet it must have had a prehistory, as is shown by its literary expression, which is as exotic and original as the social ideas that it embodies, for the earliest known lyrics of the early troubadours possess all the marks of a style and literary tradition that they had already reached maturity. So I live in the south of France, southwest of France, and so while I was reading this, it was just like, wow, I am here around the area that the cult of love came about. And I didn't know that. That was just fascinating. I think he did a really good job of not writing about the times and separating it from us today. I mean, this was written in the 1950s, I believe, so it's dated, but it's not dated. It is a piece of historical work that is presented in a way that you feel connected to the people in these different places, in the different times. And so, yeah, the cult of love was created in medieval times in southwest of France, which is where I am. I really loved the chapter on school and university. He goes into great detail about the differences between the University of Paris and the University of Bologna. So the University of Paris was known for theology and philosophy, and the University of Bologna was known for International Center of Legal Studies. And so while the great Italian philosophers like St. Bonaventure, St. Thomas Matthew of Acquasparta, and Egidius of Rome gravitated to Paris, clerics from Northern Europe who looked toward to a public career in the church studied at Bologna. It was only with the rise of the universities that Western culture acquired that new intellectual and scientific discipline on which its later achievements were dependent. The university played a very, very big part in medieval times, something I already knew, but the details of it, like I say, it's so much. I definitely have to read it again because there's just too much to know. And I think I will take more time with each chapter and look things up a little bit more. I think it's almost like a mandatory for anyone that wants to learn about medieval history. And it's a good deep dive introduction because there's just so many people and so many groups of people and so many different places and territories that it's hard to keep up. That is my 2 cents on this book. What did you think if you read this book? Have you read this book? If you haven't, are you thinking of reading it? If you have, leave a comment below. Tell me what you thought. It was really good, but just so much for me. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you in the next one. Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. Et in Arcadia ego. I have been here before, I said. I had been here before, first with Sebastian more than 20 years ago on a cloudless day in June, when the ditches were creamy with meadow sweet and the air heavy with all the scents of summer. It was a day of peculiar splendor, and though I had been there so often, in so many moods, it was to that first visit that my heart returned on this, my latest. That day, too, I'd come not knowing my destination. It was 8 weeks. Oxford, submerged now and obliterated, irrecoverable as Lyonnaise. So quickly have the waters come flooding in. Oxford in those days was still a city of aquatint. In her spacious and quiet streets men walked and spoke as they had done in Newman's day. Her autumnal mists, her grey springtime, and the rare glory of her summer days, such as that day, when the chestnut was in flower, and the bells rang out in high and clear over her gables, and cupolas exhaled the soft airs of centuries of youth. It was this cloistral hush which gave our laughter its resonance, and carried it still, joyously, over the intervening clamor. Here, discordantly, in 8 weeks, came a rabble of womankind, some 100 strong, twittering and fluttering over the cobbles and up the steps, sightseeing and pleasure-seeking, drinking claret cup, eating cucumber sandwiches, pushed in punts about the river, herded in droves to the college barges, greeted in the Isis and in the Union by a sudden display of peculiar, facetious, wholly distressing Gilbert and Sullivan bandage, and by peculiar choral effects in the college chapels. Echoes of the intruders penetrated every corner, and in my own college no echo, but an original fount of the grossest disturbance. We were giving a ball. The front quad, where I lived, was floored and tented. Palms and azaleas were banked around the porter's lodge. Worst of all, the Don who lived above me, a mouse of a man connected with the natural sciences, had lent his room for a lady's cloakroom, and a printed notice proclaiming his outrage hung not 6 inches from my